Hello, welcome to the Daily Bellringer. Please don't forget to check out the questions down in the description. Today we're going to be taking a look at the War of 1812 and the defense of Fort McHenry. Fort McHenry, arguably one of the most famous sites of the War of 1812, primarily because that's where we're going to see the Star-Spangled Banner being written. So let's get into what happened here at Fort McHenry. So, you got to remember the War of 1812. The British had landed near Washington, D.C. in late August of 1814, marched towards the city of Washington, won at the Battle of Bladensburg, then marched into Washington, D.C., set the city on fire. Then they were forced out by that storm, all right? But the British, of course, not giving up yet. They turned their attention towards a much more militarily strategic city, which was Baltimore, and really because Baltimore had this really good harbor. But there was one big difference between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. Baltimore was much better defended, and their primary defense was here at Fort McHenry. It was this fort that guarded the opening into the harbor to the main part of Baltimore. It was named after James McHenry, who was one of the signers of the Constitution, and actually he was John Adams' Secretary of War during John Adams' presidency. So the British planned a two-prong attack. They were going to land troops to the east of Baltimore and march towards the city, and then simultaneously they were going to attack Fort McHenry with their, big Navy ships and everything. And so let's get into the land portion of this attack. The British on September 12, 1814 land their troops and basically, land unopposed, but then they very quickly begin to run into Maryland militia. All right, and very, very quickly, once they get off their boats, we have a battle that ensues, this Battle of North Point. Now, the British were under the command of this guy named General Robert Ross. This is the same guy that had been in command when they burned Washington, D.C. just a few weeks earlier. All right, and so it was, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. His men really trusted him. He was really their leader. All right, they put a lot of faith in him. Well, he rode up towards the front of the battle to rally his troops, and guess what? He gets shot, and he dies a few hours later. All right, and the command of the British go over to this guy named Colonel Arthur Brooke. Now, the death of Robert Ross was kind of, took the wind out of the sails of the land troops here. Now, they keep on fighting, and actually they do force the Americans to retreat, but the Americans retreat orderly. They retreat back to the outskirts of Baltimore, and they prepare for the British to continue marching on, all right? So that's what happened at this Battle of North Point, and they aren't quite done yet. But we need to turn our attention to what goes on at Fort McHenry, all right? So Fort McHenry was under the command of this young major named George Armistead. He was only 32 years old. He had about 1,000 men there at Fort McHenry to defend the fort, and he had been preparing for this for weeks. In fact, the merchants of Baltimore, the people of Baltimore, sunk their ships, their own livelihood, their own, what they'd used to make money. They sunk their ships in the harbor, in the opening, the mouth of the harbor, to basically block it from British ships being able to get in, all right? And so the British, even if they were able to weaken Fort McHenry, they would still have a tough time actually getting into the harbor. But as I said, Armistead had been preparing for a long time for this. I mean, he had the defenses ready to go. He had everything ready. One of the main things he had done is he had ordered this giant flag to be made. And when I say giant, I mean really giant. 30 feet by 42 feet was how big this flag was. And it was made by this woman named Mary Pickersgill, who was a well-known flag maker in Baltimore. And actually, the flag is now on display in the Smithsonian if you ever go there. It's pretty cool to see this actual flag that flew over Fort McHenry. But early in the morning on September 13th of 1814, the British ships begin bombarding the fort, all right? And they're launching mortar shells. They're launching, literally like bombs that are exploding over it. And one cool thing that they're actually doing, too, is this recently developed thing known as a Congreve rocket was being launched into the fort. So when they say rockets, red glare, and bombs bursting in air, that's really what they mean, all right? And so for the next 27 hours, the British continue to bomb the fort. They launch over 1,500 shells, cannonballs, rockets into the fort. All right, and the only way that the people of Baltimore would know if they were still safe was if they could still see that flag flying over the fort, all right? And so as the sun went down on September 13th, the storm moves in, it's raining, there's lightning flashes, there's flashes of, the bombs exploding. I mean, it's like a big fireworks show going on over top of Fort McHenry. But by the next morning, the flag was still there. The British realized this is useless. They're not going to be able to get past Fort McHenry. And so they cease fire, they put their sails up, and they begin to sail back out into the Chesapeake Chesapeake Bay. So famously, of course, there was a guy named Francis Scott Key who was being held aboard a British warship. He was an attorney who was there trying to secure the release of one of his friends, someone who had been captured by the British. All right, and he's basically on this boat, you know, a few miles out away from the fort, and he can see all these flashes, all these fireworks going on over the fort the whole night. And the only way he would know if the Americans were still in control of the fort was if he could see that flag still waving. So of course, when you hear the Star-Spangled Banner and they say, "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light," they're saying, you know, can you still see that flag in the morning? So he writes down this poem called "The Defense of Fort McHenry." It's given out around Baltimore. A few days later, they set it to music. They set it to this tune called "To Acreon in Heaven," which was actually a British drinking song. And in 1931, the Star-Spangled Banner officially becomes our national anthem. All right, so hopefully you learned something there, and thanks for watching.